Trump's tariff war just backfired spectacularly as America's biggest trade partners abandoned U.S. exports for Russian alternatives, creating the largest economic betrayal in modern history. Let's begin.
The bond markets finally blew the whistle on Donald Trump's game of chicken with the stock markets.
While most observers focused on Trump's tariff announcements, the real story was unfolding in shipping manifests and energy contracts across 3 continents. What you're about to discover is how America's economic pressure campaign has backfired spectacularly, pushing even NATO allies toward Moscow's embrace. When Trump announced his sweeping tariff regime in April 2025, targeting everyone from China to India to Brazil, his administration believed economic coercion would force compliance. The strategy seemed logical: hurt their economies until they abandoned Russia. But planners overlooked a critical variable: Russia's ability to offer what America was withholding. The first cracks appeared in energy markets. As Trump threatened punitive measures against any nation buying Russian oil, European Union countries found themselves in an impossible position. They needed energy to power their economies, but American demands would force them to pay premium prices for alternatives. What emerged was a sophisticated network of alternative trade relationships that bypassed Western financial systems entirely. Russia, China, and their partners had spent years building parallel economic infrastructure, payment systems, shipping routes, and diplomatic frameworks operating independently of American oversight. The numbers were staggering from the beginning. U.S. agricultural exports to key markets dropped 23% in the second quarter of 2025, as countries began sourcing wheat, corn, and soybeans from Russia instead. European Union countries dramatically increased their liquefied natural gas imports from Russia while reducing purchases from the United States. Russian LNG exports to Europe rose 18%, while American LNG sales dropped 29%. You now understand the deeper forces that most analysts missed. This isn't just about oil or tariffs, but about the fundamental architecture of global trade shifting away from American control. The brewing conflict between Washington and Moscow was about to reach its critical escalation. Having grasped the strategic backdrop, you're now positioned to see what others missed: the precise sequence of decisions that triggered the largest trade realignment of the 21st century. The approaching flashpoint revealed itself through data that most Western observers either ignored or misinterpreted. The escalation began with a stunning revelation buried in trade statistics. By June 2025, Russia had become the primary supplier of energy to 12 countries that had previously relied heavily on American exports. This represented a $47 billion shift in annual trade flows, money that had once flowed to American companies but was now strengthening the Russian economy. India became the test case for Trump's pressure campaign. Facing threats of 25% tariffs plus additional penalties, New Delhi made a calculated decision that sent shockwaves through Washington. Rather than capitulating, Indian officials doubled down, increasing Russian oil imports to over 2.1 million barrels per day, a 60% jump. Indian companies began sourcing everything from fertilizers to defense equipment from Russia. The coordination was becoming obvious. Within weeks of India's defiance, China announced expanded agricultural imports from Russia, including massive grain purchases that had traditionally gone to American farmers. Turkey followed with increased imports of Russian steel and energy. Even European countries quietly signed new long-term contracts for Russian natural gas. American agricultural exports bore the brunt of the retaliation. Wheat sales to traditional markets fell 34% as countries turned to Russian suppliers, offering both lower prices and political independence. Corn exports dropped 28% as buyers sought alternatives that wouldn't subject them to potential sanctions. Soybean farmers watched helplessly as Russia captured market share that American producers had held for decades. Russia was systematically positioning itself as the anti-American alternative across multiple sectors. Moscow expanded its agricultural exports by 22% in 2025, capturing markets that American pressure had opened. Russian energy companies signed new contracts worth over $89 billion with countries targeted by American tariffs. American companies reported combined losses of $127 billion in the first half of 2025 as international markets shifted toward Russian alternatives. The dollar weakened against currencies from countries aligning with Russia, reflecting lost confidence in American economic leadership. You've now uncovered the critical escalation that most missed. This wasn't random defiance, but coordinated economic warfare designed to exploit America's vulnerabilities. The boiling point was approaching as Trump realized his pressure campaign was strengthening his exact adversary. If you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to subscribe to our channel. The tensions you witnessed building exploded into the open during the first week of August 2025, revealing what others only speculated about: a coordinated economic offensive that caught Washington completely off guard. The shock comes from seeing how quickly America's economic dominance can unravel when allies choose resistance over compliance. The pivotal moment came during trade negotiations in Stockholm between Chinese and American officials. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent emerged expecting Chinese compromise on Russian oil purchases. Instead, China's foreign ministry posted a defiant statement. China will always ensure its energy supply in ways that serve our national interests. Coercion and pressuring will not achieve anything. Within 48 hours, India's foreign ministry issued an almost identical statement, declaring their relationship with Russia steady and time-tested. This wasn't coincidence, it was coordination. Intelligence sources revealed the Chinese and Indian officials had spent weeks aligning their responses to American pressure. The domino effect was swift and devastating. Turkey announced expanded energy partnerships with Russia. European Union countries, despite public statements supporting American policy, quietly signed new long-term contracts for Russian natural gas. Traditional American allies began opening backdoor communications with Moscow about alternative trade arrangements. What truly stunned Washington was the scale of Russia's coordinated response. Within 72 hours of the Stockholm rejection, Russian officials announced the largest expansion of trade partnerships in the country's modern history. Moscow unveiled $156 billion in new trade agreements with 17 countries, covering everything from energy and agriculture to technology and military equipment. The numbers were devastating for American exporters. Russian agricultural sales to markets previously dominated by American suppliers jumped 41% in a single month. Energy exports to countries facing American pressure increased by 67%. Even manufactured goods saw a 28% increase as countries sought alternatives to American suppliers. Russia capitalized on the chaos with surgical precision. Moscow announced the Economic Sovereignty Initiative, offering countries complete independence from American financial systems in exchange for expanded trade relationships. The package included Russian energy at below-market prices, agricultural products to replace American suppliers, and technology transfers. The response was overwhelming. Within 1 week, 14 countries had expressed formal interest. Within 2 weeks, preliminary agreements covered $89 billion in annual trade flows that would be redirected from American to Russian suppliers. Countries weren't just buying Russian products, they were systematically replacing American suppliers across their entire economies. American diplomatic cables revealed panic in Washington. State Department officials described a complete loss of leverage and warned that the pressure campaign was accelerating the formation of an anti-American economic bloc. Career diplomats were declaring that American foreign policy had backfired catastrophically. You didn't click away because you sensed this was bigger than trade disputes, and now you possess the truth that financial analysts are still struggling to comprehend. The power vacuum that followed would reshape global economics permanently. The aftershock you witnessed during the August crisis revealed shifting alliances that others missed, the immediate emotional backlash and loss of American control that mainstream media either ignored or misunderstood. Within days of the coordinated resistance, American diplomatic cables revealed unprecedented panic in Washington. State Department officials described a catastrophic loss of economic leverage and warned that the pressure campaign was creating exactly the anti-American coalition we sought to prevent. The human cost was immediate and brutal. American farmers who had spent decades building relationships in Asian markets watched their livelihoods evaporate as buyers turned to Russian suppliers. Manufacturing workers faced layoffs as export orders disappeared. Agricultural communities that had voted for Trump found themselves bearing the cost of his economic warfare. European leaders began publicly questioning the pressure campaign. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz suggested that energy security must be balanced with geopolitical considerations. French President Emmanuel Macron warned that economic coercion risks fragmenting the Western alliance. Countries targeted by American tariffs began establishing alternative payment systems at unprecedented speed. China's cross-border interbank payment system saw a 340% increase in transaction volume as nations sought to avoid dollar-denominated trades. Russia's payment system suddenly processed international trade trade worth $23 billion in a single month. Russia's response was methodical and devastating. Moscow expanded its economic sovereignty initiative to include 23 countries. The initiative offered complete economic independence from American systems, allowing countries to access Russian energy, agriculture, and technology while conducting transactions outside American oversight. American businesses were hemorrhaging market share in real time. Stock prices for multinational corporations fell sharply as investors recognized the long-term implications. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 847 points in a single trading session as the scale of the economic realignment became clear. The agricultural sector faced complete devastation in key markets. U.S. wheat exports to traditional buyers fell 67% as countries turned to Russian suppliers. Corn sales dropped 52% as American farmers lost market share they had held for generations. Even soybeans saw sales decline 44% as buyers sought alternatives. Most troubling for Washington was the enthusiasm with which former allies embraced Russian alternatives. Countries weren't reluctantly turning away from American suppliers. They were actively celebrating their independence from American economic pressure. You continued because you recognized this wasn't just about trade relationships, it was about the fundamental redistribution of global economic power. And the political tremors were revealing something much larger than anticipated. The unresolved shifts you witnessed in those political tremors have crystallized into a new global reality that others don't fully grasp. The hidden stakes of America's economic isolation and the long-game implications that will define geopolitics for the next generation. Your investment in understanding this transformation positions you ahead of analysts still fighting the last war. 8 months after the August crisis, the alternative economic system centered on Russia has evolved from emergency response to permanent infrastructure that threatens to eclipse American influence. The Economic Sovereignty Initiative now includes 29 countries conducting over $3.2 trillion in annual trade using payment systems that bypass American oversight entirely. Russia has emerged as the unexpected superpower of Trump's pressure campaign. Moscow's total export revenues hit $267 billion in 2025, higher than any year in Russian history, as new customers more than compensated for lost Western sales. Russian agricultural exports alone captured $34 billion in markets previously dominated by American suppliers. The transformation of global agriculture represents perhaps the most stunning reversal. American wheat farmers, who once supplied 23% of global exports, now account for just 14% as Russian suppliers captured market share that Trump's pressure campaign abandoned. Corn exports fell from 31% to 19% of global trade. Even soybeans lost significant market share to Russian suppliers. American manufacturing exports faced similar devastation. Machinery sales to Asia declined 31% as buyers switched to Russian alternatives. Technology exports collapsed in key markets as countries actively sought suppliers who wouldn't use trade relationships as diplomatic weapons. The aerospace industry watched Russian competitors capture contracts worth $23 billion. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond economics. Countries that successfully resisted American pressure have gained confidence to challenge Washington on multiple issues. India has expanded defense partnerships with Russia. Turkey has deepened its economic relationship with Moscow. Even European allies now openly question American decision-making. Most critically, the dollar's role as the dominant global reserve currency faces its first serious challenge since World War II. Alternative payment systems have proven so efficient that many countries continue using them even for non-Russian trade. Central banks worldwide have quietly begun diversifying their reserves away from dollar-denominated assets. The strategic consequences will unfold over decades as the global economy crystallizes around two competing systems. America's ability to use economic sanctions as foreign policy has been fundamentally compromised. Future targets can point to the Russian model, resist long enough to build alternatives, and Washington's leverage evaporates permanently. You now fully understand what policymakers in Washington are just beginning to recognize. America's economic dominance was more fragile than anyone realized, and the attempt to weaponize that dominance has accelerated its decline. The next global pivot will determine whether America can adapt to a multipolar economic reality or continue fighting a war it has already lost. What they're planning now in Moscow should terrify anyone who understands the true implications of this irreversible shift toward a Russian-dominated alternative system. For more global news, be sure to subscribe to our channel.